If we look at the soul of man as a walled city, we see that there are defense mechanisms and there are high-value targets inside of the walled city. Now, the Bible tells us the heart is the treasure of the soul. Therefore, it's a very high-value target, and that is the target that Satan is after. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 tells us, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issue of life." The heart. Everything that takes place in your life ultimately springs from your heart. You are heart-driven in that sense. The heart is the center of our emotions, and from which we get devotion. Therefore, really, it's the engine that drives our ways, our works, and our worship. It really is the center of the soul in that sense. Matthew chapter 12, verse 35, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things." Jesus makes that very clear. The heart is the issue. The heart is the center issue to be dealt with when we talk about the accountability of man, and then answering the question, how can we change our behavior? We react certain ways, we do certain things for which we know are wrong, or the scriptures tell us that are wrong, or for which we're ashamed. How do we change that? Well, the place we start is the heart. The mind is the watchtower of the soul. So the heart is the prize. It's the place from which we get devotion and emotion, and it really guides what is produced from the individual. It comes from the heart. The mind is the watchtower of the soul. The flesh is the gateway to our soul. Now, again, when you think of this word picture, this idea of a castle, the mind would be like the walkway around the top, which is looking out and making choices as to what is going to be allowed inside of the castle. The flesh are the doorways. The flesh are the way in which the world can penetrate our life. And that's done primarily through sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing. And so we have these five senses, really, that are the gateway, for the most part, into our soul. And our mind is the one that can open and close those various gateways. We can make choices on what we look at, on what we smell or touch or taste or hear. The mind is making those choices, but the flesh is the one that allows it in, and it becomes, as it were, a fertile field in which those influences begin to flourish. Now, the flesh is the center of our appetite. And therefore, the spiritual warfare that takes place is in the fleshly part of our soul. You see, the heart of man's problem is the problem of man's heart. It's influenced by the flesh. Feelings from our flesh drive the meditation of our mind and capture our heart. The mind, which is supposed to be the gatekeeper, becomes rather an activity that is focused on harvesting the fruit that is gathered in the area of the flesh. If the flesh is uppermost in terms of controlling what takes place in your soul, what takes place in there. If you are flesh-driven, then the mind simply is meditating on the savory morsels that come into the flesh, and that captures the heart. And that's where so many people are so weakened in the area of growing as Christians in the first instance, because they know from Scripture where they should be in terms of their relationship with the Lord and their response to the influences by the world. But yet they seem to be so easily ensnared and so easily overcome by the influences of the world. Paul had this insight in Romans chapter 8, verse 5. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So then, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. You see, what we are left with is the realization that there is this war that is between the flesh and the Spirit. The Spirit now is that element which is in our innermost being. The Spirit doesn't reside in our heart in that sense. The Spirit is the influence. So when we have the influences of the world which are penetrating our soul to captivate our heart, we have the work of the Spirit which moves in and speaks directly to our heart. The Spirit doesn't speak through our mind. It doesn't speak through our flesh. It speaks to our heart because that's the seat of our emotion and our devotion. And so when we speak of the spiritual warfare, the war between the flesh and the Spirit, it's a hyperdimensional warfare that's taking place. And you, in your soul, that's the battleground. And it's not something just simple to deal with. It's very complex because you're a complex being. In verse 12, therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. You see, when we consider this warfare, the flesh needs to be subjugated, in that sense, put to death. Now, as Paul described in Romans chapter 7, the person who is still alive on this earth, who has the capacity through his five senses to sense and be influenced by the world, the war will continue until the fleshly aspect is separated from the influence of the world through the gates. When the Lord essentially shuts the doors and you're no longer influenced by the world, then those appetites are quenched because they're starved. And while we are still in this earthen vessel, the flesh, not our skin, but the fleshly aspect of our soul, is trying to be uppermost in terms of the control of the heart. And the Spirit is going to work with the heart. So we see the soul, as it were, think of that picture of the castle. We're under siege. We're in a warfare. You know, it's interesting when you travel in Europe, you don't have any of these here in New Zealand, but when you travel in Europe, especially in certain portions of Great Britain, you can see these old medieval castles. And you'll see that some of them, if they were castles that were of import, they're pretty well torn down. They've been battered down. The outer curtain walls have been destroyed. The castles really that were not of any military significance, a lot of those castles, you can go and you can still see all the outer fortresses and buttresses and everything and gates and whatever, because they were not necessarily in the mainstream of the battles going on. But we need to recognize that when we speak of spiritual warfare, we're talking about something that we are all engaged in. Now, one of the tactics of Satan is to convince people there is no war. He comes as a man of peace in that sense. There is no war. And don't worry about that aspect of your life or this aspect of your life, because it's just who you are. And we dealt with this in our first session about the fact of, as we recognize our character is not an excuse for the sin we commit. It's something that we should recognize. And so this war is between the flesh and the Spirit. Now, what are the major influences from the world that are constantly trying to gain entrance to our soul? Well, Let me ask it in another way. What is the greatest source of input into people's mind today? Entertainment. Interestingly enough, entertainment is the predominant method for influencing every culture on planet Earth. Entertainment is the opiate of the masses. You know, the Romans introduced entertainment in the early stages of their collapse. That was the purpose of the Forum and the Colosseum, was to entertain the masses, for in doing so, they hoped that it would take the attention of the people off of the decaying society. It's interesting to me to note that when you look back over the last 100 years or so, the time when governments and nations go into depression is the time that the entertainment industry booms. When did the film industry start? During the Great Depression. And you're seeing the same thing now. There's a very sharp uptick in global entertainment because it's a way for people to escape from the reality that haunts them on a daily basis. And so they will take it as something to just simply occupy their mind so they won't be overwhelmed by all the bad news. But in fact, it's a very powerful way to educate the masses. And the media understand that. And they are taking the mind of people in a direction which certainly in most instances is not biblical.